Governor Brian Kemp's top legislative priority has cleared a major legislative hurdle.
To the best of my knowledge, I can't remember a piece of legislation that had as much attention as this bill does.
This week, the push to curb civil lawsuits barely passed the House. The legislation is complex and full of legalese, but could have implications for every Georgian.
Despite last-minute concessions, some skeptical Republicans struggled with their vote until the last minute. Democrats remained mostly united in their opposition.
That was a close vote. I don't see a lot of 91s. So you knew it was by a razor-thin margin.
Plus, remember those controversial rules passed by the state election board? Well, this week they went before the Georgia Supreme Court.
Separation of powers was a pretty big deal, right, in 1777. It was established, by Locke, Montesquieu, Madison talked about it, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson.
I don't think you have to convince us that it's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
And later we'll check in on Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens ahead of his re-election bid.
And I am proud to stand here tonight and reaffirm that the state of our city is strong.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In from WABE.
All right, spring is here, and there are now just 2 weeks left in this legislative session. Hard to believe, so I want to spend a moment just taking stock of where things stand right now.
So, Sam, a number of lawmakers are working publicly or privately to move their legislation, whether it's pushing a bill through the other chamber or trying to find a way to add their proposals to another bill that has a chance of passing. We'll talk more about that later in the show, but definitely we're starting to see some of those frustrations between lawmakers, lobbyists, staffers, and even reporters.
Yeah, it feels like suddenly it is really crunch time. And also, as you're kind of alluding to there, Rahul, a lot of the action right now is happening kind of just underneath the surface.
All right, now we've done a little situational awareness. Let's dive into the week. Sam, a huge moment for Governor Brian Kemp and his top legislative priority, a key House vote on the governor's push to overhaul civil litigation rules. But it's not been pain-free. Sam, how did this all go down?
Right after the vote, we heard from House Speaker John Burns, who continued to press the case that big payouts from civil lawsuits are suffocating businesses and medical providers.
From trucking companies, landscapers, medical professionals, grocers, loggers, you name it. The consensus has been overwhelmingly clear.
But the reality is that there is far from consensus on this issue. I mean, just take a look at the final vote in the House. It was 91 to 82. Supporters needed 91 for the bill to pass. So really not a vote to spare, though Speaker Burns could have cast a vote if needed to get it across the finish line. So yeah, it's not a stretch to say that this bill squeaked through. And 3 of those critical yes votes came from Democrats, and they were needed because 8 Republicans voted no and some lawmakers didn't vote at all. Democratic Representative Stacey Evans had some harsh criticism for Democrats who broke with the party and for Republicans who she says contorted the process to get this bill through.
This bill is bad for people. This bill is bad for victims. Not only did they break a caucus position, but they let down their voters.
House Rules Chair Republican Butch Parrish emphasized, though, the hours of testimony that shaped the final bill.
We sat through over 13 hours of hearing. We heard from dozens of interested parties that talked to us about what their concerns were, what their interests were, and so forth.
Still, Democrats like Representative Tanya Miller said top Republicans did not truly hear those concerns. She called the bill an affront to the right to trial by jury.
This is an attack on the very fundamental premise that makes this country what it is.
Real quick, Sam, remind our audience what we mean when we say the overhaul of civil litigation rules. It sounds wonky, but why should people pay attention to this?
So when we say civil lawsuits, we're typically talking about a dispute where one person alleges they were harmed or injured by another person and are seeking some kind of damages or action to be taken. Think about car accidents, medical malpractice, product liability, when someone is harmed by a product, or premises liability, when someone's harmed on somebody else's property.
And Sam, one of the most notable pieces of audio that's aired on the show this session was a professor that you had on that said, "You and I are just one moment away from being involved in a tort case."
Yeah, not you and I in particular, but anyone, sure. And because another key question driving this debate is what reining in civil lawsuits will mean for people involved in these cases, whether plaintiffs or defendants, but also for insurance premiums, access to healthcare, and the business climate in Georgia. Kemp says excessive litigation is fueling high insurance premiums, which deter businesses from setting up shop in Georgia or make it harder to recruit and retain medical providers like OBGYNs. But opponents say changing civil litigation rules won't actually do anything about these issues, with no guarantee that insurance companies will pass any savings on to consumers. So if you're a business owner, a driver, a patient, an insurance policy holder, a homeowner, a renter, a medical provider, the list goes on, this debate is really worth paying attention to. There are so many changes embedded in this legislation. For a full explainer, I encourage you to go to wabe.org, where I've got a story breaking down exactly what's in this bill and where I've gathered in one place a lot of the debate we've heard over the course of the last few weeks.
We knew going into this vote that Democrats were pretty much united in their opposition and that there was a sizable contingent of House Republicans that had serious reservations. So take us through how supporters of this push secured the votes they needed.
Well, for one, Kemp made some concessions before the bill advanced out of committee this week. The changes included sharpening a carve-out for survivors of sex trafficking in this provision that makes it harder to hold property owners liable for illegal activity around their premises. Another provision requiring trials to be split into multiple parts now gives judges discretion to avoid this in some cases of sexual abuse involving minors and in cases considering damages under $150,000. Here's Democrat Stacey Evans and Republican Rob Leverett.
What is the rationale for treating victims of sex trafficking differently than other crime victims?
Well, I think it's just because of the primacy we place upon the uniqueness of their plight. Frankly, I'm just trying to listen to the overwhelming testimony we heard.
Now, Democrats tried to propose some more amendments, but they were not agreed to. And so it really came down to whether these small changes could convince enough skeptical Republicans.
So, Sam, what happens next?
Well, the bill has already been passed over in the Senate, but since changes have been made here in the House, it still has to go back over to the Senate for final approval, and that should not be too hard to pull off in the next 2 weeks. All right, I want to stay at the Capitol, where Governor Kemp had an opportunity to take another legacy-building action, this time appointing a historic pick for Labor Commissioner.
So, Sam, the Department of Labor has been under interim leadership since last November when Bruce Thompson passed away after a battle with pancreatic cancer. Kemp this week named Barbara Rivera Holmes to be the state's next labor commissioner. When she's sworn in on April the 4th, she will be Georgia's first Latina to hold statewide constitutional office. Holmes is someone we've seen around the state capitol and in state politics, most recently serving as the president and CEO of the Albany Area Chamber of Commerce. She's also served on the University System of Georgia's Board of Regents. Here's a little bit of what she shared with reporters.
I will advocate for good-paying jobs that tap into our state's talent, ensure safe working conditions, and protect secure benefits.
Now, I want to note the last thing that she said there about benefits. The department was put under a major spotlight during the COVID pandemic with the challenges around delivering unemployment benefits. As for Holmes running for election in 2026, Kemp chimed in on that.
Yes, she'll run. Yes, she'll run as a Republican.
That would put 2 incumbent Hispanic Republicans on the ballot next year unless Insurance Commissioner John King runs for something else. Okay, folks, time for a break. This is Plugged In from WABE. Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE.
Before we step out from under the Gold Dome, I want to get to a policy debate that got surprisingly contentious this week. Lawmakers this year have been debating possible responses to the deadly school shooting at Apalachee High School. And one of the proposals includes having mobile panic buttons teachers can wear in every Georgia classroom. But that effort, it hit a speed bump this week. What happened?
So we're talking about Senate Bill 17, also called Ricky and Alyssa's Law. This is similar to legislation that's passed in other states that has been called Alyssa's Law. But here in Georgia, lawmakers added Ricky, referring to Ricky Aspinwall, a teacher and football coach killed in the Apalachee High School shootings. Something that came to the forefront in the aftermath was newly implemented technology at the school that directly connected school staff to law enforcement, which has been credited for the fast police response. So Senate Bill 17 would mandate those mobile panic alert systems in private and public schools, along with being part of a school mapping database for first responders who would have access to floor plans and campus maps. That brings us to the meeting this week of the House Education Committee. This is Republican Representative Matt Dubnyk and Senate Bill 17's lead sponsor, Republican Senator Jason Anavitarte. Dubnyk starts by bringing up concerns from private schools.
The mandate to them does not come with the state funding that we've appropriated or are appropriating through our school safety and security grants. And as someone who represents a number of private schools, and they've reached out, and so we'd just love your commentary on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Representative. I've heard from them just recently in the last 24, 48 hours. You know, my response to that is I think just having consistency across the board in terms of, you know, how are we defining security in our schools from a public safety law enforcement perspective, I think is critical. I understand the concerns around funding.
Remember, each public school building in Georgia is getting about $47,000 a year for safety, and the 2025 budget had an additional $21,000 for one-time expenses like these mobile panic buttons. In the end, the committee ultimately passed the bill with the requirements only for public schools. The committee also exempted private schools from being added to the database of school maps.
Okay, so this is a situation of a senator trying to get their Senate bill through the House. There are similar scenarios happening in the reverse. At the beginning of the show, you also mentioned how lawmakers sometimes try to move their legislation forward that may have stalled by adding it to another bill. Explain that process again for our listeners and maybe give us an example.
So, Sam, remember back on crossover day, there were bills that did not make it from one chamber to the other. Some lawmakers moved on, but others looked for or even had a backup plan for their legislation if it did not cross over. And that could be using another piece of legislation to add it to or swap it out. That brings us to House Bill 61. And Sam, right now, if you go to the website, it says that House Bill 61 deals with separate license plates for ambulances and hearses. Don't ask me why that's a thing, but that's what the bill was about. Then on Wednesday afternoon, the Senate Committee on Public Safety presented House Bill 61, and it became the Georgia Anti-Squatters Act of 2025.
Okay, quite a makeover there.
So, Sam, here's Republican Representative Devin Seaball laying out the basics of the new bill.
The bill before you addresses the growing problem of unlawful squatting in Georgia by providing property owners and law enforcement with clear legal tools to remove unauthorized occupants from private property.
So this seems a bit more controversial than the legislation that was passed last year and flagged by our esteemed housing reporter Stephanie Stokes. I want to focus on one part here, and that's what to do about folks who live in extended stay hotels. Lindsay Siegel is an attorney who has sued extended stay hotels.
It would create a humanitarian crisis to essentially say that those families get absolutely no notice before they're put on the curb.
Siegel and other advocates want folks, whether they stay in extended stay hotels or they're renters who've been scammed, to have the right to appear before a judge. There was some pushback, including from hotel owners. This is Ryan Albers with the Asian American Hotel Owners Association.
For our members, guests refusing to leave is extremely detrimental. The majority of our members own limited service hotels that are solely dependent on guest occupancy for revenue.
So we'll see if this vehicle can get it across the finish line in the next 2 weeks.
Alrighty, I'm going to turn us now to the State Election Board.
The State Election Board. God, we have not thought about that one in a minute. Last fall, we seemed to be talking about them and a controversial move the board was making every single week, Sam.
Totally, but as you know, court cases can sometimes take years to wind their way through the justice system. I mean, just this week, we're still getting rulings in cases that have to do with SB 202, that election overhaul passed by Republicans back in 2021. Okay, so back to this case with the Georgia State Election Board. The Georgia Supreme Court is now weighing whether to uphold 7 controversial rules passed last fall by Republicans on the State Election Board. A lower court judge blocked the rules just before the November election. Those last-minute rules included a mandatory hand count of the number of ballots cast in each precinct and allowed local election boards to conduct a reasonable inquiry before certifying election results. 2 Republicans brought a case against the State Election Board last fall. As I mentioned, a lower court judge found the State Election Board had overstepped their authority. Now, whether that is indeed the case is a key question now before the state Supreme Court. During oral arguments, plaintiff's attorney Chris Anulowicz argued that the rules conflict with law passed by the legislature. He says that would violate the separation of powers, a principle that has been embedded in Georgia's Constitution since the very beginning.
Separation of powers was a pretty big deal. Right, in 1777. It was established, by Locke, Montesquieu. Madison talked about it. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson.
I don't think you have to convince us that it's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
That's Justice Sarah Hawkins Warren you heard there at the end. Teresa Law, another attorney for the plaintiffs, put this in the context of the hand count rule.
That statute requires that, quote, as soon as the polls are closed and the last elector has voted, the poll officers are, quote, required to seal the ballot box and deliver the ballot box to the tabulation center. The straight text of the statute simply doesn't allow for this unwieldy atextual process that under the terms of the rule need not even begin until the next day.
But attorneys for the board and the state and national Republican parties told the justices that these rules do not conflict with Georgia law and that they should be upheld. Justice Andrew Pinson seemed somewhat skeptical.
It's not just discretion, it's discretion that looks a lot like sort of setting up their own sort of mini set of laws that govern, that aren't sort of connected to anything in the code.
The defense also focused a lot on their argument that those 2 Republicans who brought the case did not have legal standing to sue. Here's lawyer Brian Tyson, who you may know as one of the key lawyers representing the state in the long-running court battle over Georgia's redistricting maps.
They're not alleging that a poll worker is not going to allow them to vote. They're not alleging that there's a prevention of their personal right to vote. They're concerned about the public right of the administration of elections related to these rules.
Rahul, the court is expected to rule in the coming months.
So, Sam, let's switch gears. We don't always have a chance to talk about City of Atlanta politics here on Plugged In, but Sam, you were able to take a moment this week and check in on Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens.
Yeah, Dickens is up for re-election this year. And, there's been a couple notable actions in the last few weeks that made me think it's a good time to check in. First, Dickens delivered his final State of the City address of his first term. And then a few weeks later, formally launched his bid for a second term. So far, he has no known challengers. Now, at that State of the City, Dickens told a crowd of VIPs that he inherited a fractured city in need of course correction. But Rahul, over 4 years, Dickens has also had his own challenges, like the Buckhead succession threat, ongoing protests against a public safety training center, and bungling communication during a days-long water outage last summer.
When they tried to tear our city in 2, we fought back and kept our city whole. When they tried to stop Cop City, we fought back and built the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. And when they try to tell us that diversity and inclusion are something to run away from, we will fight back and show them that our diversity is what makes us strongest.
Now, the mayor also highlighted efforts to revitalize downtown, curb food insecurity, and add green space. And, in the last few weeks, we've also started to get some more glimmers of how Dickens would approach a second term should he win re-election. And one that really stood out to me was the surprise rollout of a transit vision at a recent MARTA board meeting.
That's right, Sam. That was really kind of some big news.
Yeah, because it included backtracking on his support for light rail on the Atlanta Beltline's popular East Side Trail in the near future. And this is a shift that could have really big implications for how the city grows and develops in the decades ahead. If you walk the bustling East Side Trail, as I often do, between Reynoldstown and Piedmont Park, you'll see all these competing signs adorning trees, lampposts, and fence. Beltline rail now, or the opposition, no streetcar now. And here's what Dickens had to say at that recent MARTA board meeting.
Because it takes so long to build out 22 miles, certain parts of it are already extremely dense with a lot of activity, a lot of walking, a lot of commercial nodes, a lot of restaurants. There's a lot of disruption that will happen if you try to do it all at once.
Dickens says rail on the East Side Trail could come later, meaning that controversial debate will likely fall to a future mayor. One other thing I want to highlight here, I mentioned the water crisis last year. Well, this week, Dickens held a press conference at the Shirley Franklin pumping station in West Side Park.
And people would think it's weird to name a pumping station after her. She, back then and even now, lovingly called the sewer mayor.
Yeah, she was lovingly called the sewer mayor for spending a lot of political capital to upgrade city infrastructure. But today, there are still many pipes that are 100 plus years old and continue to cause water main breaks and other issues. Well, the city is embarking on a 20 plus year plan to upgrade that infrastructure. It could cost something like $2 billion. And while some of that funding will come from the feds and from current water rates, Dickens was asked if Atlanta will be asked to hike its water rates as DeKalb County recently has.
Right now, I can't say that a water rate increase is on the table or off the table. I can't tell you that over the next 20 years that this project is going to take place, that won't be requested of ratepayers.
Rahul, so many of these topics are challenges that are not going to be fixed overnight, but part of this conversation will be whether progress is being made in the right direction and whether it's happening fast enough.
All right, Sam, before we go, we were talking about the 2025 elections. Let's look even further ahead to the 2026 elections, as this weekend, U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff is launching his re-election bid with a rally alongside U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock in Atlanta.
Yeah, it's being billed as a rally for our republic. Organizers say Warnock and Ossoff's victories in 2020 and 2021 were inspiring to the nation. And now at this moment, Georgia, quote, must again light the path out of darkness. I will be at the rally this weekend, Rahul, and we will bring you more next week.
So that's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE. Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure to head on over to the Plugged In feed to subscribe, leave us a rating and a review. You can also find us every Friday morning on the radio at 90.1 from 9:30 to 10 a.m.
Happy spring, y'all.